Welcome to another episode of the One Hood Power Hour, and the first episode of our special sub-series of the One Hood Power, the legislative visits that we'll be doing on the last episode of every month. So we're excited to welcome you to the first episode in that series. I'm here with my co-host Miracle, and we'll be joined momentarily by our other co-host Kahari Mosley. So we'll be doing our first legislative visit tonight. We'll be talking with three state legislators who are working on the Pennsylvania Juvenile Justice Task Force. So we'll be talking all about the different issues that they're working to address. The general operations of the task force, how all that has been going over the past several months. What sort of recommendations they'll be putting together, and how that'll impact all of the legislative processes and potential reforms that may come from that related to juvenile justice. So really excited to get into that tonight. It's only been a week since we've last joined you on the Power Hour, but it feels like we have about 4 weeks of things to discuss. We had the first mayoral debate for the primaries on Friday with Gainey, Mayor Peduto, Tony Moreno, and Will Parker, who I believe will be running as an independent in the fall. The George Floyd trial started today, so that'll definitely be something to keep an eye on. Obviously, we had the voter suppression law that passed in Georgia, that I'm sure Miracle will have several hot takes on in a moment. And we also had Lil Nas X put out a music video that has now rivaled WAP in terms of backlash from conservative podcasters and pundits alike. So we might have to do another episode along those lines, just as we did for WAP. So I'll pass it off to Miracle real quick for any hot takes she has, related to that Georgia law, related to anything else that's been going on. So like I said, it's been a long week in that regard.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Ryan. It has definitely been a long week. Like you said, the trial of Derek Chauvin did start today with opening statements. And so while we don't go into anything too in-depth, I'll give a general, conversation. Disclaimer that we'll be talking about police violence with this particular topic. It was very interesting to watch the opening statements or read the transcripts of the opening statements that happened today as the trial began. It's clear that the prosecutors have been listening to a lot of previous prosecutions and are really trying to go to make sure they hit every element, the recklessness, the indifference to human life. But as we also saw, that the defense, given everything that's going on in the world, is trying to create an alternative argument, one that represents the officer side without creating a lot of division and anger. And so it's going to be a very interesting time to watch this trial again because of COVID-19 and other things going on. This trial is going to be a little bit different. There is limited amount of people who are able to physically be within the courtroom. And so we are going to be able to see a lot of information as the trials are live streamed, but there'll probably time when there are exhibits that may not be shown. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how, in the time of COVID, a very public trial is going to deal with transparency and balancing community interest and outreach. But like you said, there's a lot of other laws going on across the country. We did see in my home state of Georgia, a bunch of bills were consolidated into one. So now in the state of Georgia, there is a limited amount of hours for early voting. There's limited set number of drop boxes. And they basically divided up the Secretary of State's power so that literally when the next election happens, there can be different rules for different precincts, and it's going to have to go county by county, which is going to make it a little bit more difficult. One of the biggest issues outside of the voting limitations is that this bill basically outlaws giving food and water to people while they wait in line. The way subsection 3 of the provision reads is that people in line are not only the 150 feet barrier, but 25 feet from the last person in line. It says only poll workers can give out water. So there is no provision for food, tea, sodas, anything else. And if you're not a poll worker and you give food and water to people in line, you can be convicted of a misdemeanor. And so, of course, we know this is going to be going up all the way to the Supreme Court. But it shows how important it is really for politicians, for nonprofits, for organizers and activists to really talk about local election laws, local election rules, because there's still a lot of questions surrounding what and how elections are going to be conducted. Even this upcoming election, there still hasn't been a lot of information about will there be drop boxes, when is the mail-in ballot, when are they going to be finalized and sent out. So there's still a lot of questions. So people on all sides, have issues around how we're doing elections, especially in a global pandemic. But like you said, there's a lot of stuff going on. The funniest is not the funny. It's not really funny. But I think the most interesting news has been the Suez Canal. Like the ship stuck in the Suez Canal. It's estimated around $10 billion a day is being lost in trade to this shipping container being stuck. It was removed earlier today. And so we're going to be seeing in the upcoming weeks delays in shipment, but we don't know how much will be impacted. So that's another thing to keep a lookout for, especially for small businesses. A lot of small businesses, rely on trade, rely on international trade, rely on the Postal Service to supply their products and demands. And so it's going to be interesting to see as we have just started, reopening the country, getting investment in business, quote unquote, back on track, to see what this Suez Canal debacle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, Miracle. Yeah, like I said, so much has been going on. I forgot to even mention the ship, that blocked the entirety of the Suez Canal for several days. But it's finally been dislodged. But yeah, that that was another huge point to make. And thank you for that really informative breakdown of everything that's been going on with that consolidated bill that passed in Georgia. As you mentioned on the show before, Georgia and North Carolina are often the testing grounds for a lot of these, voter suppression bills and pieces of legislation. So it'll be really interesting and, really impactful to see how all of that plays out with court challenges and just, general backlash and overall, the eventual outcome of that entire situation, being able to see how that, will impact potential legislation all around the country. And on that note, I believe we have our other co-host, our director, Kahari Mosley, in the studio. So we're going to bring him in real quick as well.
How you doing? How's everybody doing?
Good, thank you. How about you?
Awesome. Yeah, just for my, quick take, hopefully you didn't mention it because I jumped in the studio right as the show began tonight. But, President Biden will be in Pittsburgh on Wednesday to tout his multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package. And from what I understand, I haven't had a chance to really dig deep into the granularity of the policy, but it appears to be the largest investment in American infrastructure probably since the Eisenhower administration, which is remembered for creating the interstate road system, which at the time, definitely was, one of the more, futuristic, infrastructure programs in the history of the world. A lot of that came, during World War II, when then General Eisenhower, I believe Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower, got to see the infrastructure in Germany, like the Autobahn and things like that, and thought, strategically, how important that would be economically and from a military strategic advantage, be able to move goods and services much more efficiently around the country. So it's really, very interesting to see, this plan being unveiled, and obviously being unveiled in our home city of Pittsburgh. It's obviously very important, because we know Pennsylvania is a swing state, has a very important Senate race in 2022. So we'll all be watching very closely on, this plan and how it gets rolled out, and how much, traction it will be able to get, from the other side of the aisle, if they have to, get over that 60 vote hurdle, or is this going to be the bill where, they actually get rid of the filibuster and move forward? So it's going to be very interesting to see, how, the details of the infrastructure package, as well as how it's received.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Oh no, go ahead, Miracle.
Yeah, I was going to say this is also going to be a turning point in administration, because environmentalists like the Sunrise Movement and the Greens have really been pushing this like Green New Deal, and Pittsburgh, we've had the bike lanes, this need for like economic green investment in infrastructure. So it's going to be very interesting to see what is in the bill. We know there's a lot of fracking, there's a lot of oil industry as well, here in the southwestern part of the region. And so it's going to see how all these competing interests are represented in the bill, because at the end of the day, we do need jobs, we do need an investment in infrastructure. Anyone with the potholes can tell you that this would be something that a lot of people are going to be looking forward to. But I think this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to actually bring a lot of diverse parties to the board, to talk about investment, to talk about local jobs and supporters, and to talk about how we can invest and rebuild infrastructure that is going to create better homes, create better connections, but also not cause further environmental issues. So I think Wednesday, I think a lot of people will actually be tuned in on Wednesday, just because of all these competing interests and all of these interest groups who are very involved and invested in this topic.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. There's definitely a lot of, from what I understand, there is some green infrastructure stuff in there and green economic development. I think it's going to sit in an interesting place, because I don't know if it's enough for the environmental movement, but more than likely it will be too much, for the fossil fuel interest. So it'll be interesting to see, where, kind of, the Joe Public and Jane Public, fall, in between, those two interests, as well as the third interest of, the Biden administration of trying to, show that they are, making strides. And, as we all know, infrastructure does create jobs. And it's interesting, up until maybe, 15, 20 years ago, in many ways, even though there was nothing as big as this, or as big as, Eisenhower era initiatives, there was a general consensus that, infrastructure was kind of a bipartisan thing. That does not appear to be, the case anymore. I think particularly as the green economy has more so intersected with infrastructure over the last 10 or 15 years, from, the American Climate and Security Act, ACES, the cap and trade bill from the early Obama administration, to the Green New Deal, to things that even during the Rendell administration, that I'm sure Senator Williams and Senator Acosta could speak of with a lot of background, the Growing Greener initiatives and things like that, that they played a significant role in themselves as legislators. So you're right, Miracle. It's going to be fascinating to see, what happens on Wednesday, and then, how the politics, play out, because it's always policy and politics, and that's the tricky part. That politics often gets in the way, of the best policies, and has to create a compromise that oftentimes no one is happy with.
definitely. And I think on that note, we can go ahead and introduce our first guest for this legislative visit. So first, we'll be speaking with Representative Mike Zabel, who is a state representative out of Delaware County, and he's one of the co-chairs of the Juvenile Justice Task Force that we'll be focusing on this episode tonight. So we're really excited to have him here. And if he's in the studio right now, I think we can go ahead and bring him in. Yep.
Hey guys.
Representative, thank you for joining us tonight. So if we just want to start off real quick, just with a little background about the task force itself, the reasons for forming it, what specific issues it's focused on, and what some of those primary objectives are.
Sure. First, thanks for having me, Ryan, Miracle, and Kahari. I enjoyed listening to a little bit of the conversation you were having. Politics and policy is exactly right for pretty much everything, including this. But so the Juvenile Justice Task Force was something that was commissioned by Governor Wolf over a year ago. In fact, now probably about 18 months ago. But the idea was to bring together a bipartisan interbranch group of people. When I say interbranch, I mean from the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch. Bring people who are involved in the juvenile justice system from all over, put them all together, and look at the data and essentially evaluate how our system is doing. We didn't come in with a mandate to fix a problem or do any particular thing. What we were coming in with is we were going to look at what works, what doesn't work, how we can make things stronger, or if something needs to be fixed, how we can fix it. So we've spent we started in February of 2020. Obviously, COVID happened, so we've had to extend just a little bit. But we have over months and months, we've heard lots of testimony from stakeholders, for everyone from kids who are currently in the system to judges and all sorts of things, and just trying to compile what we think are the best policy recommendations for our juvenile justice system going forward.
Thank you for that. And in the time, in the year, and rather, because I heard 18 months, in the year and a half since, this body has convened. What are some of the major takeaways from you?
Well, for me, a lot of the data was really interesting. I learned, I'm a former prosecutor, but I didn't do juvenile cases. I'm also a former school teacher, so this hits both of my areas. I was really surprised to learn that just how disproportionate the number of kids who enter the system enter it for low-level offenses. By that, I mean really trifling stuff. We're not talking about murders or aggravated assaults. We're talking disorderly conducts or inability sometimes to just pay a fine, that sort of thing. Most of the kids who are entering our system are coming in for those reasons. I was shocked to learn, too, how much it costs to put a kid in a residential placement facility. That's essentially the juvenile version of prison. And I was also, one of the things I really was surprised to learn is that most of those low-level cases are not diverted from court, meaning, once you get something into a courtroom, there's a process that's started that's hard to get out of. But particularly with kids, we've seen that if you divert them, if you say, okay, maybe a program, an after-school program, or maybe this program, or maybe that can help you find a better path, but we're not necessarily going to start you in the court system. That works, and it's not being done a whole heck of a lot, or it's not being done enough, let me put it that way, because diversion is really successful, and it's not done nearly enough. And then one of the biggest things that I've learned from this is there are disparate impacts of our policies in the juvenile justice system. It varies from county to county, but one thing that we've seen a real problematic racial result is that if you, particularly if you are a Black non-Hispanic boy, you are likely to receive the most punitive responses in the system, meaning you're most likely to be removed from your home, tried as an adult, or placed in the system. It is disproportionate that way. And part of our challenge has been to look at all this data, all this evidence of injustice, and say, how can we fix this? How can we make this right? And that's no easy task, but I'm grateful that we're looking at it and doing it.
So you mentioned, one thing that's particularly interesting, that these diversionary programs haven't been used, to that broad of an extent, even for low level offenses. And I was just curious if that was because of any legislation or mandatory sentencing guidelines that's on the books right now, or is that just generally how that process is played out with a lot of discretion in there still?
That's a good question. Some of it has to do with the local preferences of the judge or the prosecutor. But when you're talking about low-level offenses, part of it is just an approach that we've had in this country for 30 or 40 years with regards to crime and punishment, this idea of being tough on crime, which meant, and this means this at the adult level too, really punitive responses, like throwing the book at people, putting them in the system, making them understand there's consequences. That was the thought, but this was as far back as the 90s. That was the thought. But we've seen now over a couple of decades what happens, that punitive sentences and punitive treatment, where you're really coming down hard on somebody, doesn't produce any of the results we want in terms of a society, both at an adult level and a youth level. For adults, for example, it means mass incarceration. It means putting a whole generation of people, removing them from their families, depriving people of the workforce, and spending a lot of money. It also has that effect with kids. And perhaps what's even more tragic, when you're putting a kid in the system, they become, in many instances, more likely to recidivize, more likely to do something else. And then you're making the problem worse, not better. I don't think people came from a bad place with it, but we've learned over time that severity of punishment isn't a deterrent to crime. So what we're starting to think about, and I think this is productive, because this is something where conservatives and progressives have come together for different reasons, but have come together and said, for example, a youth, if we put him in placement or her in placement, it can cost the state up to like $192,000 a year to keep to keep them in that placement. $192,000 a year, which is more than it would cost to keep them at home. It's more. I'm a father. My kids don't cost me $192,000. I wouldn't be a legislator. That's for darn sure. I don't think any of us would. But if we take that money and we say, what if we put less kids in placement and we moved it to the front end so that we were spending more money on keeping kids out of the system, about getting them help elsewhere? That's a real opportunity for us. And it's time, I think, for us to try that. And I think that's where our task force is headed. We're still working out some of the details of what exactly policies will be. But I think there's an understanding that if we reinvest to the front end, we might be able to really change some people's lives for the better.
Miracle, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much again, Representative, for joining us. I did have a question, because I know you said the recommendations are still being developed, but is there a general consensus of what the recommendations are going to be asking for? Again, I know they're not fully developed yet. And then also, when it comes to education, for a lot of the individuals, youth who go through the system, a lot of times there are interruptions in the education. And I was wondering, with the data, were you all able to find any particular patterns about what education looks like for these young people as they go in and out of the system?
That's a really good question, particularly for me as a former teacher. It's a real concern. One of the things that we found with the educational programs that are offered to kids once they're in placement is not sufficiently. They can wind up taking classes that don't count towards a GED. So they're taking these classes. The classes are of varying quality, and it's not actually helping them get a path forward with a degree. So we have to improve the interaction between the residential programs and the Department of Education. But I think one of the solutions is to make sure that less kids are being removed from school and are in real school rather than learning in one of these institutions. Some of them do great jobs. The problem is it's not uniform. And that's a real problem. So that is one of the things we found. We have to improve how education is done within that system. In terms of big scale, I don't want to speak for the group too much because there's a group of about 40 of us, and I don't want to speak for all of them. But I think we recognize that we need to shift. We need to be doing less emphasis on residential placement, generally more emphasis on diversionary and informal adjustments, stuff that can happen at the beginning. And we need to be open to giving kids more chances to be kids. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody falls, and sometimes there, but for the grace of God, go any of us. I got in a lot of trouble when I was a kid, and if I had been in a different situation, I could have been placed in the system pretty darn easily. But I was fortunate, based on my background, that there were people around me who gave me a chance and didn't throw me in a jail. So that's a thing we're looking at, and I think we're also looking at how much it doesn't really make sense to treat kids as adults in the criminal justice system. It doesn't really produce any positive effects. And that's a particularly important one to me because before I was involved with the task force, I still am an attorney, but I represented a gentleman named Tyrone Jones, who was convicted of a murder that he allegedly committed when he was 17 years old, and he was sentenced in Pennsylvania to mandatory life without parole. Well, the United States Supreme Court came out with a law that said you can't do that. You can't sentence somebody to mandatory life without parole for a crime that they committed when they were under the age of 18 because their brain is still developing. They're still you have to at least allow for the possibility that they can reform and get better. And this guy, my client Tyrone, was a wonderful man. He'd been in prison for 35 years, no problems, and he had no shot at parole under the law until the Supreme Court case came along, which was all about the psychology of the brain. We know more about the brain now than we ever did before. And now Tyrone was paroled thanks to this and is working quietly, living a quiet life on a farm in North Carolina and being a productive, happy citizen and not costing Pennsylvania any money. That's justice to me. It's the same thing with kids. We have to understand your brains aren't fully formed. What sense does it make to lock them away? We've learned, for example, that the decision-making part of your brain isn't done until your 20s, done forming, literally forming, which certainly comports with my life experience in terms of the choices I was making in my early 20s. So we've been focusing a lot on data and science, and I think that's important. It's an important departure from politicians who just like to run and say, I'm tough on crime, which sounds good, to sometimes to some voters, but it's destroying lives, and I'm hopeful that we're moving away from that.
And you as a former prosecutor, knowing in Pennsylvania, at least the lead, the person who represents the prosecutor's office in counties are elected, and many run on that platform. What type of message, what types of things can we do to kind of retrain our prosecutors, to think differently, about this approach, and really understanding the collateral damage economically, socially, that's having, because anybody, who's a fiscal conservative, has to be troubled by just the sheer amount of tax dollars we spend, without anything coming back. These folks would be so much more productive as carpenters and construction workers, or like you said, as farmers, paying taxes, working, than getting thrown in the system. As we know, I grew up on the north side of Pittsburgh. I was lucky to kind of avoid most of it. I had a really, really strong, father who didn't play, but I watched so many of my friends, that grew up, like you said, that were great kids that, got locked up, went to juvenile hall. And then that basically became like, Yale University or, Harvard, for crooks, and they go there and they come out, with master's degrees in crookology, you know, when they were, you know, like freshmen in high school when they went in.
That absolutely happens. In fact, that's part of the argument against putting, aside from the moral arguments, against putting kids in adult prisons, which happens sometimes. But we've seen that. What happens if you put a 16-year-old in with some hardened inmates in an adult prison, and of course, what are they going to? They're going to try to survive in that climate, and you pick up your master's degree in that. So it's tough. I say with some sympathy for prosecutors. When you're working in that office, you tend to be exposed to tough situations all the time. And so you can kind of develop a hardened mentality with a dim view of human nature. And I think that's a little bit of what we're up against, but that's where we as legislators, our job is to make the laws fairer, because a prosecutor's job is to apply the law. And if we say, well, no, we're not going to automatically file these cases, we're not going to automatically charge every kid as an adult, we're taking that discretion out of their hands. That's what I think has to happen. I think, so I was a prosecutor in Philadelphia, and there was under Seth Williams, and at that time, Seth Williams was, to his credit, saying, I don't know if prosecuting marijuana should really be a priority for us. We've got bigger fish to fry. And I think there's something to that. If we said, guys, what if we can, and when I say guys, I mean prosecutors, if we could take some of the smaller, low-level offenses and stop clogging the courts with that, and let you work on the really serious community safety-oriented offenses, maybe there's a benefit to that for you. It lets you focus on what's good or what's the most important, and not have you tied up with big dockets. Because even prosecutors, they have long dockets of cases, and it's just you work your way through them. I, as a prosecutor, would walk into a room with 30, 50 cases and just try them back to back to back, and people become statistics. But if they have less crowded cases, you can kind of see some of these people, I think, more readily as human beings, or I hope.
Absolutely. And just as one final question before we move to our next guest, I did want to give you the opportunity just to speak about and just to ask you about the recent I believe closure at this point of the juvenile facility in Delaware County. All the abuses that were reported there, and everything that's resulted with that. And it's obviously it's not the first instance of this Glen Mill School and other places in Pennsylvania. So just how much cases like that have impacted people's stances on this, the findings and recommendations that'll be coming from the task force, things like that.
I hope it's going to impact a lot of people. I know task force members that I've spoken to are impacted by it. It is heartbreaking, the allegations, absolutely just staggeringly horrific, and shocking, but unfortunately not a surprise. Delaware County has certainly had these issues, but we can't, much like, for example, gun violence and other, we have to treat this like an epidemic. This is something that's going to keep happening until we do something about it. So I'm hopeful that in Delaware County, we're going to get a thorough investigation by the Attorney General, and that the wrongdoers will be punished. But not only that we will use this as an opportunity to move away from residential placement for youth. Kids do better when they're at home. And I hope if there's something good that will come out of this horrible situation, it's that we move more towards that and take care of our kids and treat them like kids, not like hardened criminals. So I'm optimistic that something good will come out of it, as just utterly heartbreaking and infuriating as the situation is in our detention center.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for joining us tonight. All the information you've given us about the task force. About your experience in that field. And just all the great information you've given us tonight.
Thank you guys for having me. And you've got two much smarter gentlemen coming up right after Senator Costa and Senator Williams. So they will give you some real some real insight. But I appreciate it, guys. Thank you for the thoughtful conversation. I don't even mind the Steelers banner in the back there. It's all right. I can't really talk as an Eagles fan. Not right now. All right, guys. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Be well.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so as the representative mentioned, we'll now be moving on to our second guest, who is also the co-chair of this Juvenile Justice Task Force in Pennsylvania, and that'll be Senate Democratic leader Senator Jay Costa. So you can go ahead. I believe he's in the studio as well. Yep.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Good evening. Yes. Good evening, Senator.
Good evening.
Hey, Senator. Thank you for joining
me.
us.
Sorry, how you doing, buddy?
What was that, Senator?
Yes, I'm having a hard time hearing some folks.
Oh, really?
Yep, I hear a lot of static. I heard a good bit of what Representative Zabel was talking about, and I think he really gave a great description of where things are at and how things are playing out through the task force. Like him, I serve as one of the co-chairs, Senate co-chair. Myself and Senator Lisa Baker are the two Senate co-chairs, and she's the chair of the Judiciary Committee. And we've been proceeding down this path for many months now, almost over a year now. And it's been an eye-opening experience for me to learn a lot about some of the things that have been going on in our juvenile justice system. I'm not surprised by some of the things because back in the day, I didn't work in this system. Back when I was in law school, I worked for the sheriff's office, and I worked in juvenile. I was assigned to juvenile court, and I had visited a lot of the locations across Pennsylvania. You mentioned Glen Mills. You mentioned some of the other programs that he mentioned. And what was interesting, looking at the data, listening to folks who testified, and reading some of the reports that have come forward, what we learned. And we learned that folks of color were disproportionately being housed in these facilities and with not great outcomes. We also learned that the nature of the offenses that would lead someone to being incarcerated or residential placement, as it's called, were offenses that were, in some instances, technical violations. What you hear oftentimes about are technical parole violations or probation violations people get incarcerated for. The same thing was here. The level of offenses that led to the entry into the system, as Mike said, sometimes you can never extract yourself from. Were surprising. The amount of money that we spend, and knowing that there are many better ways to use those valuable resources to be able to put them in the front end and spend them on the front end to be able to allow folks to get the services that they need, the wraparound services. And a lot of times it's just not the child that needs the service, it's the family as a whole. And we should be able to put resources around the family in a holistic way to be able to ensure that kids don't recidivate or don't get into the next level of trouble that would be harmful to them. And as I mentioned earlier, put them in the system and sometimes making it difficult to come out. But when they do come out, it's not it does not end up in a good way. Though that was the stuff that was really disturbing to me. Certainly what we learned about Delaware County's system or what we knew about Glen Mills, or even years before, we thought we addressed the issue with regard to the Cash for Kids program up in what I'll say Northeast Pennsylvania. All those experiences, it just amazes me that despite what we already knew then and what we saw in Glen Mills, these type of things continued, and it's frustrating. So we're taking an approach that I think we're going to recommend some significant changes to the system. And there'll be some folks who may not be happy with what we're going to recommend, but I think it's important that we make the right decisions based upon the data, based upon the evidence and the information we have before us. We know what other states have done. That's been a big part of what we've looked at as well. Looking and seeing what other states have done in this space, and had folks testify from other states about the success they had in terms of converting their systems into one, the juvenile justice systems into one that is more beneficial for the children who make their way into it, and the treatment that they'll be able to receive, and a program that supports them. The diversionary stuff. I mean, looking at the nature of the folks who get diverted out of the system as opposed to do not. Again, the disparities were incredible. If you happen to be white with a little bit of resources, you were able to figure out a way to divert yourself from being incarcerated or going to, in our case, the Human Center, for example, on the front end. But if you were not, you're a person of color, you were more likely on the same offense to end up going down a different path that put you into the system. And that was the problem that we saw very clearly. So our recommendations are going to be a significant part of the recommendations going to be about like all but significantly reducing out of home placement or residential placement, which I think is going to be a significant departure from what we do right now. Now, I would tell you the composition of the commission, as the Representative Zabel talked about, it is bipartisan, it's bicameral, it is by, the legislatures involved, the executive branch, folks from the courts. I mean, you name it, we have everybody engaged, and also folks in the community, the District Attorney Association, the Defenders Association, all the different folks who participate in this space. Voices are weighing in on the preliminary recommendations that we put forth. And we're not there yet, quite frankly. We still have, of the 40 or so recommendations that are on the table right now, we probably have some disagreement, probably on maybe a third of them yet, that we still have to reconcile and work out. And then once we do that, and once we make recommendations and state the nature of the consensus as it relates to one, because there won't be unified consensus on some of these. It's just not going to happen. Given that you have, the judges that are on there from the judiciary, the Juvenile Justice, JCJC, Juvenile Justice Commission, you have other folks who are not necessarily of the same level of wanting to revise the system to the degree that we think it needs to be revised or reformed. If you put it on the spectrum, you got some folks who want to go, all the way across, but you also have folks who want to, for example, allow judges to retain some authority in some instances outside of the ones that we all agree upon to be able to do placement outside of the home. That's one of the issues we're arguing with right now. We haven't reached consensus. So we've got work to do in that space, but you're going to see a significant number of consensus recommendations that I think are going to help shape and reform the system as we go forward. And I think that's what's interesting. And the most important part is what we do with the resources that we save. As we save resources by doing less placement, we have to be thoughtful and strategic about where we place those dollars, making sure that they're, as I mentioned earlier, in a more holistic way, wrap around the students, or wrap around the kids, and also to the family to that degree. I also, with the conversation came about education, that's a great question because kids are going in and out of placement in residential settings, and it breaks the continuity of education. And what we know now in the systems are that the education that's provided doesn't necessarily rise to the level consistently across Pennsylvania. And we got to be able to provide the kids, if we are having to get on the pathway to be in a residential placement, that we need to be more thoughtful about the educational services that are there as well. And there needs to be better consistency and uniformity across the state in that space. Now, I will tell you, I think we're very fortunate here in Allegheny County. Our juvenile justice system, in many instances, what I've learned through this process, because again, there are folks from counties all across Pennsylvania, we've got a pretty darn good system. And I got my hats off to Judge Kim Clark, who's been a very active participant in these conversations and is like-minded in terms of the things that we're talking about. Judge Clark has done an outstanding job in helping, shaping, and framing some of these issues for us going forward and trying to really find the right balance about what needs to be done, recognizing that there's a judicial component and wanting to work with the kids and retaining a little bit of authority that she's facing with her colleagues. But at the same time, knowing that what we're doing now, taking kids and putting them into settings that they're not going to succeed, that they're going to fail, and disproportionately doing so, that's the most troubling part, and I think we have to work on it. But getting back to the educational piece, there's more we have to do in that space. And if we have an appropriate amount of alternative placement for kids, keeping them out of the system, putting them on a different track when they offend, work with them in that space. And I think things will be better going forward, certainly for the young kids who are involved, but also for our communities as a whole. So I rambled on a little bit. I apologize, but I think Representative Zabel laid everything out. So, we'll probably reach some by the end of the month, if not early May. We'll have concluded in recommendations, which we will provide to the legislature if there needs to be statutory changes. and then then the discussion will be taking place in the legislature to try to build a situation where we can get 26 votes in the Senate for a measure and 103 in the House and get the governor's support, which I do believe we will get there. But then also there'll be policy changes that we will recommend as well, that the Department of Human Service would need to implement, that maybe the courts would need to implement, looking at those areas as well. So it just won't be a statutory approach. It'll also be a policy approach, which I think is going to be important. So at the end of the day, I think you're likely to see some pretty good recommendations in the space that will help change the way things are being done now. And I apologize rambling on.
No,
No,
that was all great information.
well, what you call rambling, I call answering about 11 of the questions I had wrote down. So thank you for that. Yeah, and I just wanted to.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's a lot clearer. I can.
Yeah, a little bit better.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. Anyways, thank you for all that. You answered about some of the questions I had written down. So I appreciate you rambling on. But I just wanted to ask real quick. Both you and Representatives Zabel have talked a lot about potential reforms to the juvenile justice system itself. I also wanted to ask about if any of the recommendations will deal with the process for sentencing and charging juveniles in the adult criminal system as well.
If I heard the question right, are we going to make any recommendations regarding charging offenses, charging juveniles as adults? Is that the question?
Correct. Yep.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah, there's been some conversation. We've broken our task forces. Representative Zabel said there's about 40 people on it, and we're in different segments. Like we have broad group discussions, but I'm on the disposition side of it with Judge Clark and some others. But on that particular area, I know there's conversation along those lines, looking at the factors that you look at before you make that determination. That's one of the things that's being considered as we speak. There's some who believe that that window is too much of an opportunity for folks to inappropriately charge in that space, charge young folks as an adult, and then thrusting them into the adult system, which is not obviously good at all. But there's some who believe that there's reasons to be able to do that. So that's going to be one of the conversations that we have, and likely not reach a total consensus on, but it'll be a recommendation that we review that. So, and that's how I think we may phrase these recommendations, saying this is what we considered. There's not a unified consensus on this issue. Here's what some people believe, and then here's what some of the concerns about this particular recommendations might be. But that's part of the conversation that we're looking at, charging as adults.
Just a quick follow up to that. Was there any particular issue that surprised you that there was consensus on, that you didn't think there was going to be consensus on?
I think once we saw the data, I think it was hard to ignore that what we do in terms of how we remove kids from the home and across the Commonwealth, and it's different in different counties, of course. I think that surprised me, how quickly I think there was a uniform consensus around we need to change this. Seeing the disparities that were taking place, and in some instances I mentioned the low level of offenses that would end up with kids being removed from the home on the first offense, for example, or maybe a second small offense. I was surprised to see that folks across Pennsylvania, not just, we're from the urban setting in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, and there are a number of folks from Southeast Philadelphia and the like, but folks in between, who I would tell you on some other issues aren't as understanding, but I think on this one, there was a consensus that, we're spending a lot of money in this space, and we're not getting the results. And at the end of the day, we're in many instances destroying a young person's life, or minimizing or reducing his ability to grow and become a productive member of society. Once you get them in the system, and that's the problem, we got to keep them out of the system. If we're able to do that, things are better. And I think the acknowledgement that that's the case as well was something that probably surprised me. I was surprised by the overwhelming data that demonstrated what I just described. That did surprise me. I didn't think it was going to be that crystal clear that we have a problem in terms of how we place kids in residential settings. it was alarming.
Yes, and again, thank you so much for, like you said, coming on and talking about the task force. One of the questions I had was about just trying to keep youth in homes, trying to make sure that we're not putting them in these facilities. What type of interventions and supports would theoretically families have for resources? I know you talked about it's not just the person, sometimes it's the whole family that may need support. So my question is, with this task force, what were some of the resources that whole families would have access to?
So I don't know whether we're going to get into specific recommendations to say this particular type of program is the program that they should choose, but I do think you're going to see some conversation about that. We need, as we divert kids, we're not putting them in the system, into the process, but rather diversionary stuff, particularly in the outset, the first offense, the second offense, that that there'll be acknowledgement that the more of those things we do, the diversionary programs, that within that, they need to be broader in terms of who they're working with. It can't just be working with the kid and trying to address what the needs might be. It may be educational needs. There may be housing issues in the family. There may be employment issues in the family. There may be mental health issues in the family, Senator Ron, that's all part of this. That all needs to be part of the dialogue and the conversation about a young person as we go forward. So we won't specifically say, here's who you need to talk to, this organization works best or whatever, but rather working with, just recognizing that it needs to be a more holistic approach as we go down a path of trying to divert kids into programs, more programmatic activities. To me, that's what I think you'll likely see through this process. Now remember, we've got to go through, this is just 40 folks who have an interest in this space, who work in this space. We got to take it from there and take it to the legislature, where it's a whole nother challenge. I would tell you that. And so how we roll this out in a cooperative and in a thoughtful way is going to be very, very important. How we bring our allies in from in our caucus, myself and Senator Williams, we've got another number of other folks who are very supportive of what's taking place here. But we have to win over a majority of legislators in both chambers. And so what things actually look like, the end product, is going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But we have our work cut out for us. We have some folks who in the group, as I mentioned, are pushing back and trying to change some of the recommended language. That's what we're struggling with now. What exactly do we say? And so we have to find the right balance through this process as we go forward. But what I think is important is we have to take these steps. If we do these recommendations and they're not right, and we don't frame the legislation in a proper way, we could be setting ourselves back for a number of years. So we have to take a step forward. And the stuff that I think we have sort of what I'll call low-hanging fruit are the things that we must get done. And to me, that means that we have to take a significant approach towards changing the mindset with respect to the value and the role that residential placement plays. It does not have the value that I think a lot of people believe it has. And once you see the data, and once we share the data with our colleagues, that'll be helpful for us to be able to experience, so they understand what steps need to be taken as we go forward as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for breaking that down. And the final question I have for you before we move on to our final and third guest, Senator Williams, was actually, largely following up with what you just talked about. You've talked about how there's, a lot of bipartisan consensus, which is surprising in some cases, on a lot of the issues and recommendations being discussed in the past. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts. And, obviously this is tough to say, and, you have your work cut out for you on this, like you mentioned. But, how much bipartisan agreement you anticipate, being able to achieve in the legislature on a lot of these issues, given the data that you have that's been able to turn a lot of minds within the task force itself.
Yeah. If I hear your question right now, there's a lot of static, and I'm sorry, maybe on my end, but I will tell you, we have to build a case with some folks. I mean, there is in our Senate chamber, I think we have a number of folks on our side of the aisle. I would tell you, I don't think there's going to be any problem. I think Democrats are going to be where I think where they need to be. They'll understand, about 10 or 11 of us, maybe more than that. 10 come from Philly and Allegheny alone. And when you incorporate the Southeast, we're probably about 16 or 15 or 16. Our challenge is going to be on the Republican side of the aisle. I'll be very blunt, and trying to convince them that that these are thoughtful investments that we're going to make on the front end by redirecting these resources. And it's something I would imagine many of them are fiscal conservatives and are law and order type folks. I think they would appreciate that, the understanding that we are redirecting resources from incarcerating or redirecting them from out of home placement and putting them on the front end and wrapping them around the families and the kids. That's going to allow us the opportunity to make the investments that are going to help everyone involved. So in my view, it's a win-win. And I hope they would approach it and see it that way as well. But that's going to be our challenge, getting those last 10 or 11 votes on our side of the building to be able to get it through. Now, we've got Senator Lisa Baker, who's been an outstanding co-chairperson in this thing. She serves as our judiciary chairperson. She was also the architect in many of the measures that we passed a number of years ago when we had the Cash for Kids scandal. If you're not familiar with that, that's where the judges and the lawyers were working together to, regardless of what the kids did, they ramrodded kids through the process and put them into a facility that was owned by the guy who was giving money to the judges to do that. So it was remarkable what was going on. They finally broke through and realized what happened. Those judges are sitting in jail. There's 2 of them that'll probably sit in jail for another 15 or 20 years. They've been there at least 10 or 12 years already. So that's the type of stuff that we have to prevent. So I do know that we can get the consensus that we need along those lines going forward. We just have to convince about 10 of them, and I think we will. But Senator Baker was the architect of the many measures that ensured that as kids were represented in these meetings and these hearings, that they had counsel, that their family had counsel, that there were reviews that were taking place through a period of time. And this is one of the things, by the way, that we're talking about as well. When there is an instance where a child is placed in residential setting, the length of time that goes by before you review the matter and what measures you look at to see if the child is improving. We're putting very limited, really strict timelines on. Instead of waiting 6, 9, or 12 months before you go back and review the performance of a child who's in placement, we're going to require it either 3 months or 6 months, and it's got to be a report that's filed. And the judge, by the way, has to make a determination on the record that why he feels the need to place a child. These are all things that we don't have now in the system. So there's a variety of these other little things that I think are going to make things better going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for jotting that.
All right.
Down. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you guys very much. We're going to have a good next person. Senator Tony Williams has been a good champion in this space as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for joining.
See you. Take care, guys. You're very welcome.
Take care.
Bye.
On that note, a little bit behind schedule as always, so appreciate the patience of our third guest for sticking with us this long. So we'll be joined right now by Senator Anthony Williams from the Philadelphia area, who has also been working diligently as a member of this task force. So thank you for joining us, Senator. Your microphone is muted.
I'm sorry about that. Thanks for having
no
me.
problem.
And thanks for having this conversation because I think it's very important.
Awesome. Well, first, before we start, I do want to mention that I just want to mention about, wow, it seems like a lifetime ago, but it was about 15 years ago. Governor Rendell was still governor, and he had a Black History Month awards presentation, and I happened to be a lucky one to get the award, and he gave an award to your father, and I believe it was your brother that received the award. And just the story that he told about your father's life, man, it was just so inspiring. And we did have a chance to talk briefly at David Dick's wedding, but I never got an opportunity to talk about how inspiring that moment was at the governor's mansion. So I did want to just take an opportunity to give a shout out. And you just come from such illustrious family. I mean, you've done a lot on your own, but I'm sure it's quite an honor to also carry that name, Hardy Williams, as well. So Thank you for joining the show. It's always an honor to have you on. Yeah, so if you could just talk a little bit about your background and history in, this issue and how you got involved with the commission.
So Carl, thank you for those kind words about my family. My father's deceased, and so they needed a little bit more. Every time I learn more about my father from other people, another person's perspective. So they were very generous, and I humbly accept it. So thank you so much. In terms of me, it's been part of, I guess, my childhood. My intention was not to be a public servant, but nonetheless, my family's involvement in civil rights activities. My father was a lawyer, a defense attorney, and a lot of this subject matter comes from my childhood experience, my teenage experience, my adult experience, and now my legislative experience. And I guess people term it as my lived experience. And for me, because I guess I've been an advocate in this area for such a long time, I was selected by the governor to be a part of this body. And I'm appreciative of that because it gives an opportunity for me to create a platform about viewing these issues from a little bit different perspective. There's 40 members on that commission, of which there's only, I think, 7 people of color, 1 Latino, the others African Americans. And so we sit in a very responsible but different place than some of my colleagues. And frankly, some of our approaches and perceptions about the activity of the task force a little bit different than some of my colleagues.
Thank you so much again for joining us. We talked earlier about the racial disparities that happen in the system when it comes to particularly these young people, especially young ones who are treated as adults. My question is, when you're looking at this data, is there any other similarities that you're looking at that shows a need or a cause for a particular intervention?
Well, there's an immediate intervention as it relates to 2 aspects. 2/3 of the children that are in the system. I want people to know this. We start charging children at 10 years old to send them away. 10 years old. And almost 100% of them are African American or brown children, going to places that are housed by non-African American folk. That is not an accident. And so that's significant in terms of any child, any adolescent who will be sending away for discipline at that age. The natural inclination for a person like me is to say, certainly what the child did, but more importantly, what are we doing or not doing right as adults for them to be engaged in such activity at 10 years old? And clearly, the data shows that overwhelmingly, it's one population. And so I guess for some people, if their view is that Black and brown people of modest income are always disruptive, always doing something negative, I guess it wouldn't be shocking to them. But for those of us who come from these communities who know that we have doctors, lawyers, scientists, justices, prison guards, police officers, Marines, all types of people come from the neighborhood in which I grew up as a child. They have served this nation, and the overwhelming majority of them pay their taxes and do right by this country. And so this data shows you that there is a clear bias against those individuals. And then once they're in the system, the consequences once they're in the system, we can continue to talk about. But those things are immediately alarming to me, let alone the tragedies which have occurred in some of the sites that have been talked about earlier on the program.
And being from Philadelphia, and we know that there's definitely I've seen as you know, my wife was a member of the legislature from Allegheny County, and I spent a lot of time in Harrisburg before she got elected as county controller back in Allegheny, and I would see that it seemed like there was I don't obviously want you to ruffle the feathers of your members, but I'll say it for myself, like I felt kind of an anti Philadelphia bias. You don't have to say one way or the other how you felt about it, and when it comes to these issues, and I always felt there was a certain racial element to it as well as an outside observer. So when it comes to trying to reform these issues, and even more so from Allegheny, how much does Philadelphia bear the brunt of this bad policy? Because I just feel like disproportionately, Philadelphia, economy, the social fabric, the communities, and the people of Philadelphia bear the brunt of this policy, in a way that it's not even felt in a county like Allegheny.
Well, the most outrageous part is that the majority of the children come from southeastern Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular, and house themselves across Pennsylvania. And what we discovered is that and listen about this. In one of those places, Lima, that was just shut down, $500,000 contract for 4 children. That clearly tells you that the system's not around reforming any child, protecting any child, reintegrating any child. It tells you the system is designed to pay somebody. And so for me, you're absolutely right. Do I believe that there's a bias towards Philadelphia? Yeah, because most of the Pennsylvanians think that we're urban, we're not rural, we're not suburban. With all due respect, we're not white. And so even though we're a significant, probably the majority population drives the economy in Pennsylvania, we do serve, as a response. We are the brunt of a lot of these policies that disproportionately affect our children. And we pay a disproportionate amount of the tax dollars towards them while we don't receive the services in return for them. So that being said, let me be very clear. I want Black in America. Fair ain't always part of the conversation. So I'm not here to complain, but I'm also not here to wait. So, while some people will debate how we go about this, I'm not. We have a governor who's a Democrat. There are policies which can be changed. We've had the pattern of abuse, frankly, bordering on illegal activity. Those policies can be changed under executive order. Not everything, but we need to start from these recommendations, which are modest in my opinion, but go more dramatically towards policies that we can change immediately after this report is released.
And I also just wanted to ask about, and correct me if I was reading any of this wrong, but I was looking at the composition of the task force again recently, and I saw that there's a lot of, that there's at least, a few youth members on there who I believe are people who were impacted by the juvenile justice system. And so I just wanted to ask about, how and to what extent the task force has been able to center their perspectives in this, given that, they're the most directly impacted individuals on the task force. And how they've how you've been able to use their perspectives, to advocate for recommendations that would best serve those individuals, and help remedy issues like that extremely disproportionate impact across different racial groups.
So it depends upon if you're listening. I frankly often find circumstances like this, and I don't want to say disrespectful, but we use children as props. We roll them out of hearings, they give testimony, and we say, "Oh, isn't that wonderful? Look how articulate they are," and then we don't do anything with what they've said. I hope that's not going to be the case here. But that generation is represented in real terms, and frankly, not as graphic as it could be, but in real terms, the consequence and the impact upon their lives. So they've had an opportunity to speak their voice and have a perspective heard. The question is what those of us who have an ability to vote upon those perspectives do with it. And I'm very concerned that it does not just become a dog and pony show to suggest that we've listened to the generation. Because it's sort of like going to your doctor and you're bleeding from your arm, and the doctor says it looks pretty bad. And I hear what you're saying, you're in pain. We should do something about it. And then leaves the room and doesn't do anything. So I would hope that's not what we're going to do here. We need to do major surgery and repair this broken part of government.
Miracle, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I did actually have a follow-up question. Sorry. I wanted to know, here in Allegheny County, we had a situation where 4 people who were placed in adult facilities were actually innocent. There were 4 young individuals under the age of 18. And I know that there is a lot of disagreement about what to do about juveniles being charged as adults and juveniles placed in these facilities. And my question is, can you go a little into why that is being such an issue on the task force? And then also, can you talk about, from your experience, have there been any bright spots? So he talks about, the proposals being modest and not going far enough. And I was wondering, has there been any type of outcome that has surprised you so far, that has given you hope that there is an ability to have some movement on this issue?
So on the lifers, that's not a significant part of the conversation, primarily because usually the actions of the individual who's involved are pretty significant in terms of what's occurred. And so, regardless of whether you're white or black, there is a issue as it relates to protecting society. Usually, those charges are brought when some incident involving murder or some level of harm to other people, which is viewed as egregious. Now, the reality is, in this country, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. But as we know, once the newspaper, media, online, streaming gets involved, the DAs feel like it's important to charge someone or overcharge someone. If you don't have money, you're already behind the eight ball. And so, when you ask, why has this not been more of a central issue? I would guess because the numbers of individuals in this space are much dramatically less than the children who are caught up in a system where they clearly shouldn't be, no matter what. I would guess that would be the issue, along with social, racial biases that are part of the conversation. Limited resources certainly don't help that. The areas that I find to be promising are the fact that the data shows that taking a young person, 2/3 of them almost now, and putting them in this system does nothing to reform them, does nothing to help them grow and mature and understand whatever shortcomings they have. In fact, it probably hurts them. And on top of that, graft, greed, corruption, and all sorts of negative activities are occurring within the institutions are further part of the data that we see. And I'm grateful that the Pew Foundation decided to invest in this kind of conversation. So I find that very promising, because it's not like you can sort of just have an opinion for the sake of having an opinion. You have to argue against facts. And so I think that's very important.
Ron, did you
Miracle,
follow?
are you driving across Pennsylvania? Where are you driving to?
I actually left Pennsylvania to drive to Ohio. So I've been driving for like 4.5 hours. I'm actually out by my destination. I do apologize. There's some
No, it's no problem.
construction that intervened.
Yeah.
But I did have one
That's
more question, because
go ahead.
how also is juvenile probation factored into this conversation, because we're also talking ways to keep children in community and not interrupt the continuity of their lives. But we also know juvenile probation also is a big factor, with people having to pay fees and fines, with people having to check in, even sometimes check in with the probation officer during the school day. So I was wondering, how has there been any type of conversation around that as well?
There have been, and there's a significant debate that I think hopefully we should win. It's, as you know, a problem with adults. It certainly is a problem with young people. Any kind of probation requiring you to do 10 things for a year is a difficult challenge for any quote unquote person who's not involved in that system, let alone somebody who's involved in the system. And frankly, what we see is young people extend their period of time under the system simply because of probation. The fees are one thing, but the requirements, and you just mentioned one of those requirements. Suppose a young person has to go to school and then after school go to work, right? Suppose a young person's homeless. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we know factually to be the case that prevent them from not being a compliant person in terms of probation. So that's one of the areas that we are focusing on to try to resolve that and give some standards so that the judge just doesn't prolong that process because they want to perceive a young person being disruptive, but has to recognize the reality of a young person's life as well as their lifestyle.
Yeah, and then I did have I had one other question. Given what we've heard from Senator Costa and Representative Mike Zabel, it seems like as of right now the recommendations are going to be coming out sometime later in April or early May. And so since all of that is still ongoing, is there any opportunity for groups engaged in this type of work, researchers or just concerned individuals in the community in general, to provide any sort of testimony or public comment to the task force in any regard?
It's a great question. Yeah, great question. So that's a great question. Yes, there's opportunity to write to the task force. No longer are we really taking testimony, but we certainly are creating an opportunity for people to express their opinions to us. So we encourage you all to do such. I don't have it with me, of course, the website to report to, but myself, Senator Costa's office, Senator Mike Zabel's office can give you or anyone who's on here the information we call offices. And of course, we're a public official, so we're posted. All you gotta do is look us up, and we will certainly provide that opportunity. And in fact, I just thought of this. I think the DA's Association may have another opportunity to make their perspective heard. So we would look forward to hearing from you all to provide a balanced perspective of what's going on with the system. So we look forward to doing that.
Now, thank you so much. I just have one final question for you. Like beyond folks making their voices heard. What message should folks be sending to their individual legislatures? Because we know that a big piece of this is going to be folks in all parts of the Commonwealth, whether they're fiscal conservatives that are concerned about all the treasure that we spend, that we just throw at this system that obviously is not productive. What do you think is the most powerful message, and particularly for those folks and in parts of Allegheny County that aren't as progressive as parts of Philadelphia and parts of the city of Pittsburgh? What can we tell citizens to tell their representatives that may be on the fence or even maybe on the other side and not as willing to support these very needed reforms?
So Kahari, I think that's like the fundamental issue, right? Because some people would like to make this a Democrat, Republican, left, right, black, or white, Philadelphia, non-Philadelphia issue. It is not. If you are a fiscal conservative watchdog, you should be screaming at the top of your head, saying, why is somebody making a profit, regardless of where these people come from, and not delivering any results? Period. There's no data that suggests that spending $500,000 on children is making a result in the system. In other words, these children come home, and I don't care whether you're Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, Philadelphia, Erie, Harrisburg, York, all these areas are experiencing some level of violence by a generation that we have not seen before, black and white. And many of these children are coming out of these institutions. Matter of fact, a significant number are coming out of these institutions because they're programmed to be violent. And so if you're fiscal conservative, you're wasting your money, period. There's no sort of dinking and dunking. And I would also say this, I heard, Senator Costa talk about we got to sort of manage this. No, we don't. The same people who voted for Donald Trump voted for Barack Obama. There's something in that water that tells you they're not Democrat or Republican. They're not all racist. We got to stop wasting our time on, who's on the left, who's on the right, and talk about what's best for Pennsylvania. And this is not best for Pennsylvania. So I hope people listening to this would talk to folks in those districts that people assume wouldn't be involved. You have a number of civic organizations, like civil rights organizations in those communities, church organizations in those communities. And I don't care what kind of church it is. We need to reach out to them and let them know what the facts are. And when the facts speak for themselves, they will be shocked that children are raped, beaten, and we're spending money on that, not by accident, and it's systematic across the board. And so my hope is that, Kahari, what you just mentioned is a central part of the conversation. And that is, don't just simply lay back after this is over and assume that your legislator is going to do the right thing. They may not be planning to do the wrong thing, but if they're not pushed to do the right thing, they just may lay back and not do anything.
Senator Williams, and once again, I appreciate you, speaking to the urgency issue. Or sorry, Miracle, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, I just had just like one last question about the task force and some of the data. We're talking about interventions, we're talking about keeping families together. And I'm wondering with this data, how, especially asking for the governor to possibly exercise executive orders to correct some of this information, how do you foresee families getting help with these new recommendations and with the executive orders?
So one, you can quickly reduce the level and size of placements in Pennsylvania through the governor's office. You can drive back towards Department of Health and Human Services through a lot of what this occurs. The fees and fines we can begin to change, and those orientations, those two specific areas, would begin to reduce the amount and size of the system. It wouldn't necessarily correct all the defects, but the reduction in the system would begin to force reforms of the system. So those two things can occur like almost immediately.
And Senator, thank you for joining us, answering all those questions. Providing all that insight from your experience on the task force, and sticking around an extra 20 minutes or so as we run a little bit behind schedule. So thank you again for your time and for joining us tonight.
Yeah, I want to say a couple things. One, I'm excited that you all are taking this up because not enough people know about it. Hopefully you'll talk to your neighbors about it because the outrage should be just unbearable. Once people know how wrong this is, they can't stand back because of how egregious the behavior is. So I'm grateful that you all are doing this tonight to spread the word across the board. And I would say, in agreement with my friends from Southeastern Pennsylvania, Kahari and Miracle, at least you did not have a Steelers flag in the background as you were moving around. I cannot even believe he actually did that. It took everything in me to be respectful in the process. You are talking to a dude who is green and white. You understand what I'm saying, Ryan? Do not let me find you out there, brother.
The Steelers
well, I watched the Eagles game with you. We watched the Eagles game at Dave Dixon's between the reception at Dave Dixon's wedding at the Hershey.
There you go, brother. Tell them.
I think they won I know it was there. I think they won the division or something. I know it was a big game, and the Eagles fly was everywhere. Y'all was doing this. Y'all was jumping on the bar. It was a good time though. Well, I went to IUP. I went to IUP with a brother from Hunting Park and a brother from Winfield. Those are my two best friends. So you know what I mean. I kind of say I'm cross-state. I'm somewhat of a Sixers fan, and I enjoy seeing the Pirates play at Citizens Bank Park. And you got our boy Kutch.
There you go. There you go. Hey, you all be safe, okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Senator. Appreciate it.
All right, take care. Bye.
This is why we're gonna have to get our hilarious.
I would have defended a little harder.
Steelers flag is
right now, but they're not good enough to come to that type of defense right now.
Listen, it's a conversation starter.
But I can't vouch for Senator Woods. He is a huge Eagles fan. At David Dixon's wedding, who is a friend of mine who's appeared, on the show. When he got married, it just so happened to be the same day the Eagles were playing a big. I think they were playing the Redskins, but it was like one of those last games of the season where they had to win. And I'm pretty sure Nick Foles came through. And I think it was the season after they won the Super Bowl. But I happened to be in Philadelphia the day after the Super Bowl parade, going to a Jay Electronica concert. That was wild.
Oh, wow.
That was wild, man. Like Philadelphia shows out, man.
The few. Yeah, well, that is crazy. All right, well, did we just lose Miracle right before our usual weekly rundown? Looks like
possibly.
Let's see, Kahari, do you know it off the top of your head to step in for?
I do believe that tomorrow for Wet Black Pittsburgh needs to know. Actually, my former high school basketball teammate, Bomani House,
Wow.
who was a fellow member of the 1991 Perry State Champions. We just had our 30th anniversary on March 22nd, which was also my birthday. Last Monday's show. I was 15 years old, a freshman on the basketball team, and we won the state championship on my 15th birthday. If you can imagine that. And Bomani was 2 years ahead of me. He was on the team, so I've known Bomani since I was in ninth grade. But more importantly, he will be talking about Black wealth. And now that Miracle's back, I guess it probably made sense that you stepped away just so I could, talk about my high school buddy and my and my high school basketball teammate.
He knows everybody in the Allegheny.
After the J Electronica concert, it's fine. Like literally, I'm waiting for the Kahari biography because I know it's just going to be like amazing. But yes, so we're talking about what Black Pittsburgh needs to know at 2:00 tomorrow. Talking about wealth, talking about possibly reparations, finances, investment. We know with COVID-19, a lot of people are still struggling, but also people are creating businesses, trying to find different avenues, income, trying to figure out what to do with their stimulus check, what to do if they haven't gotten it yet, what to do if they're still waiting on unemployment. So we're talking about financial wealth. So tune in tomorrow at 2:00. On Wednesday at 6 p.m., we have This Week in White Supremacy. It's a lot going on, Unfortunately, there's things happen every single day that hurt us, that makes us disappointed, but it also gives us tools and options as to come together as a community to build coalitions and to create a liberated community. So that's what we have for this week. Putting on your calendar to save the date. On April 12th, which is like 2 weeks from today, we're going to be having a forum about the school board. So a lot of the candidates for the school board will be joining us to talk about their positions, to have a discussion. Next Thursday, there is going to be another mayoral debate. Our C3 One Hood Media has partnered with a lot of different nonprofits under the leadership of Pittsburgh United to host another mayoral debate talking about economics, housing, and the environment. So make sure you tune in to that on next Thursday. I'll let you know. But as always, thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will turn it back over to Kahari and Ryan.
Thank you so much, America. I do want to remind any candidates out there running for office for either the statewide appellate courts, district magistrate, school board, or mayor or council in your municipality in Allegheny County, and you haven't, received our questionnaire for the report card that we're going to release at the end of the month. Again, outside of the slate of 8 that we endorsed last week, we're not going to be endorsing in other races, but we are distributing a questionnaire to those candidates, and then we will be releasing a report card similar to other organizations based on those responses. So you could always email Ryan at onehood.org if you haven't received one already, and we will definitely get those out, and we're continuing to get contact information for the various candidates running for various offices around the county. But again, district magistrate, school board, mayor, council, not just city of Pittsburgh, because we know there's 130 some municipalities in Allegheny County, and many of them have folks running for a variety of offices, as well as a Superior Court, Commonwealth Court, and our candidates for Supreme Court. So please reach out to us. We want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to weigh in.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you one more time to the legislators from that task force who came on tonight to speak about that. If any of the other legislators on the task force or anybody else working on the task force, whatever, like to come on the show, definitely just reach out. We can do another show on it, with updated information maybe after the recommendations come out. But yeah, we would love to hear from anybody else on that. And just for anybody else watching the show who's concerned about that issue, just to echo the words of our final guest, Senator Williams, be diligent and intentional about reaching out to your state representative or state senator, and expressing your concerns on this issue. Whether or not they're a member of this current task force, because we're likely to see some sort of reforms or recommendations or legislation appear in the legislature, after these recommendations come out. So this will definitely be an important ongoing issue that we can all advocate for.
Absolutely. And with that, we want to thank everyone for joining us. And again, our guest, Representative Mike Zabel from Delaware County, Senate Democratic Leader Jay Costa from Allegheny County, Steeler fan and Eagle fan from the illustrious Williams family of Philadelphia, State Senator Anthony Hardy Williams joining us as well. I want to thank them all. Look forward to continuing this conversation and bringing them back on, in May or June once, these findings and the report and the recommendations are released. So until next Monday, well, actually not next Monday, but, we also will have a Sunday sit down coming up at 7 p.m. So check us out. Look for an announcement soon on that, and then join us next Monday for another, One Hood Power Hour. But remember, from here on out, the last episode of each month is going to be like this. It's going to be a legislative town hall where we speak specifically with state legislators about policy happening in Harrisburg and policy making that's happening in Harrisburg to give folks a wider range of issues so folks can really understand what's happening under the Capitol Dome. And so with that, come back next Monday, come back this Sunday and check us out. Until then, stay safe, stay engaged, stay involved in the process, and thank you for joining us. This has been another episode of the One Hood Power Hour and the special legislative town hall. Thank you for joining us. See you next week.